Most people have never stopped to ask themselves, fundamentally, where does law come from? What makes a mere rule into a law? Now, that question will keep philosophers busy for centuries, and I don't propose to answer it here. But one way to answer it is to say that almost all the land in the world has now been divided up into specific areas, which are known as nations. From massive Russia right down to tiny little Kiribati, each nation is defined by its territory. Each nation has its own way of making laws, whether by a parliament or a king or a dictator, and that lawmaker is sovereign within that geographical area. Nobody can tell the sovereign what to do or what laws to make. Sovereignty, the power to make laws for a nation, is the foundation of all power. If that's the case, though, where does international law fit in? Because international law makes rules, but the United Nations doesn't control territory, and it's not a world government. If ultimately all power is at the national level, then how does international law even work? Well, international law began as a series of treaties and conventional agreements between the nations of the world. Rather than fighting constant wars, they made agreements with one another. So when international law began, it looked more like a series of contracts than like law as we usually know it. But then from 1914 until 1918, the horror of the Great War led to a widespread view that the relations between nations should be made more formal and more ordered in order to prevent such tragic slaughter from ever happening again. The League of Nations was born as a permanent meeting place for the nations, with a permanent court of international justice to enable them to resolve disputes. Each nation, becoming a member of the League of Nations, retained its own full sovereignty. The League of Nations couldn't impose its will on members, but those members came intending to make agreements for rules which they would obey, because that was better than war. The League of Nations lasted until the next great tragic conflict in the Second World War, and after that war the modern United Nations was founded. One of the key principles of international law agreed by the members of the League of Nations and described in the case of the Lotus was this. Now, the first and foremost restriction imposed by international law upon a state is that, failing the existence of a permissive rule to the contrary, it may not exercise its power in any form in the territory of another state. In this sense, jurisdiction is certainly territorial. It cannot be exercised by a state outside its territory. So within each nation's borders, that nation has supreme lawmaking ability, and no nation may impose its laws on any other nation. And that extends to ships flying the flag of a nation. Those ships are like little islands, remaining under the laws of their flag while they're on the high seas. All of this brings us to the case of the steamship Lotus. In the middle of the night, on the 2nd of August 1926, when the Lotus was carrying mail past the island of Lesbos in the Aegean Sea, heading up past Gallipoli and on to Constantinople, now known as Istanbul, in Turkey. Lieutenant Demont was the officer of the watch on the French ship. They didn't realise it, but they were on a collision course with a Turkish coal-carrying vessel named the Bozkurt, under the command of Captain Hassan Bey. The much larger French ship crashed into the Bozkurt and tore it in two. 8 people on board the Turkish ship were killed, and 10, including the captain, were rescued before the ship sank. The Lotus, having rescued the survivors, continued to Constantinople. While they were there, both Lieutenant Demont and Captain Hassan Bey were arrested and held for trial. Ultimately, they were both convicted. Lieutenant Demont was sentenced to 80 days in prison and a fine. Captain Hassan Bey was sentenced to a slightly heavier penalty. France objected to Lieutenant Demont being tried at all. They said he was a French officer on board a French ship on the high seas. The laws that applied to him were French, and Turkey could not exercise its sovereignty in relation to the acts of a Frenchman aboard a French vessel. Turkey, on the contrary, argued that regardless of the law aboard the SS Lotus, the acts of Lieutenant Demont had had their impact aboard the Bozkurt, a Turkish vessel under the Turkish flag, and the laws of Turkey could apply. Furthermore, they argued, Lieutenant Demont had been arrested while he was in Constantinople, the capital city of Turkey, and therefore under Turkish authority. The two countries being modern and civilised, they did not go to war over this incident, but rather took their dispute before a neutral umpire, the Permanent Court of International Justice. The question before the court was simply this: could Turkey pass a criminal law allowing it to arrest and try people for acts which occurred outside Turkey, but which had their impact in Turkey? France said that Turkey had no such power because it could not point to a specific provision of international law which gave it that power. Turkey, on the other hand, said that it was sovereign and needed no permission. Rather, it was for France to try to point out any rule of international law which restricted Turkey from passing that criminal law. The court, by majority, with a number of dissenting judges, agreed with Turkey. The court said international law governs relations between independent states. The rules of law binding upon states therefore emanate from their own free will, as expressed in conventions or by usages generally accepted as expressing principles of law and established in order to regulate the relations between these coexisting independent communities, or with a view to the achievement of common aims. Restrictions upon the independence of states cannot therefore be presumed. They applied this general principle to the specific situation in the Lotus case by saying, far from laying down a general prohibition to the effect that states may not extend the application of their laws and the jurisdiction of their courts to persons, property and acts outside their territory, it leaves them in this respect a wide measure of discretion to adopt the principles which each state regards as best and most suitable. This meant that Turkey had every right to try and to convict Lieutenant Demont. The court again, once it is admitted that the effects of the offence were produced on the Turkish vessel, it becomes impossible to hold that there is a rule of international law which prohibits Turkey from prosecuting Lieutenant Demont because of the fact that the author of the offence was on board the French ship. This case became the basis for what is known as the Lotus Principle in international law, that nation-states are sovereign and are fundamentally free to make whatever laws they please, provided those laws do not impinge on any rules or restrictions which have been agreed by the nations in the course of establishing international law. No state needs to ask for permission to pass whatever laws it pleases, because nation-states are sovereign and the institutions of international law are not. One final aside in relation to this case: the Turkish Justice Minister became so famous within his nation for winning this case that when the nation of Turkey adopted Western-style surnames in 1934, he took the surname Bozkurt, the name of the Turkish ship in the incident.